Hello, this is Rod Martin. In this video, we will be looking at top 10 facts that prove CO2 does not drive global temperature. Number 1. Major Holocene warm periods, 1,000-year cycle. Climate has always changed, and quite often it changes in cycles. During the current ice age, short, warmer interglacial periods occurred once every 41,000 years for the first 1.5 million years. Then, for some unknown reason, the occurrence of interglacial periods switched to an average 100,000-year period. During our current interglacial, the Holocene, we have had a warm period once every 1,000 years or so. Our modern warm period is merely one of 10 major warm periods of the Holocene, which have shown up once every 1,000 years or so. Our modern warm period would have shown up with or without human CO2 output. Though Greenland isn't the whole world, some scientists feel that it is a rough proxy for the entire planet, the best single location to represent the current state of the planetary climate. Greenland is, after all, at the center of the northern hemisphere glaciation that controls whether or not we are in a glacial or interglacial period. The fact that our modern warm period was already scheduled by nature means that a significant percent of it was natural and had nothing to do with CO2. Only if the modern warm period were far warmer than all the other Holocene warm periods could we attribute a significant portion of cause to CO2. Number 2. The modern warm period is the coldest of the Holocene's 10 major warm periods. This is despite the massive output of CO2 from modern industry. Even though the modern doesn't show up in ice core data, we know that it is the coldest major warm period of the Holocene. First of all, the medieval warm period was the coldest of the first 9 major warm periods. And second of all, we know that the modern is colder than was the medieval. How do we know this? The Vikings could grow crops in Greenland for hundreds of years, something that is not yet up to Viking standards in modern Greenland. The Vikings found wine grapes growing far north of where they can be grown today. The English could easily grow wine grapes in northern England, a feat not duplicated until recently. And the Germans could grow wine grapes at higher altitudes than they can today. Notice the downward trend throughout the Holocene, and notice how the downward trend accelerates starting 3,000 years ago. If CO2 were a key driver of global climate, then the massive CO2 outpouring during the 20th century would have reversed this cooling trend, but it didn't. Number 3. Late 20th century warming was slower than early 20th century warming. This is despite far more CO2 being output during the late 20th century. The late 20th century warming from 1970 to 2000 was at 0.41 degrees Celsius for the 30-year period, while the early 20th century warming from 1910 to 1940 was at 0.5 degrees Celsius for the 30-year period. Notice the 60-year cycle. If CO2 were such a powerful warming force, we would expect the rate of warming during the late 20th century to have been steeper than the early 20th century rate of warming, but it wasn't. Number 4. Mid-20th century global climate actually cooled. This was during the time when CO2 output was exploding. The massive outpouring of CO2 could not stop the cooling from about 1940 to 1970. Number 5. The pause. After the 30-year warming at the end of the 20th century, global temperatures leveled off. According to the 1,000-year cycle of major Holocene warm periods, we seem to have reached the peak of the modern warm period. This is quite evident in the satellite record of temperatures. In fact, natural forces have already started on the cooling side of the cycle with summer snowstorms in Canada and Russia, snow in the Sahara, including in Egypt, and record cold in Europe. The claims of record heat in the 21st century are largely fraudulent. We don't have a perfect surface temperature network, Large areas of the planet are not covered, and the most thorough network, that in the United States, is heavily flawed. Temperature stations have been discovered in asphalt parking lots, next to air conditioning exhaust vents, and at the end of airport runways collecting all that jet engine heat, all locations of unnaturally high temperatures distorting the temperature record. Like the cooling from 1940 to 1970, the pause, starting about 2000, will likely turn cooler as the sun reaches its sunspot grand solar minimum. If CO2 had been such a powerful warming force, we would not have had the pause in global warming. Number 6. Al Gore's CO2 temperature correlation and false causation. Al Gore showed in his film, An Inconvenient Truth, a large graph of 650,000 years of temperature and CO2 levels.
Now, as I said, they can also measure temperature. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, well, let me put it this way. If my classmate from the 6th grade that talked about Africa and South America were here, he would say, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But they did, of course. And the relationship is actually very complicated. But there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer because it traps more heat from the sun inside.
This is the only time scale with a strong correlation between CO2 and global temperature, but the temperature was the driver here. Temperature controls the amount of CO2 dissolved in the oceans. Warmer oceans, like warmer soda, cannot hold as much CO2 fizz. There were no SUVs, industrial smokestacks, or coal-fired power stations 650,000 years ago. CO2 was never the driver of temperature on Al Gore's big graph. Number 7. On the scale of tens of years, CO2 and global temperature show very little correlation. Notice the lack of correlation between CO2 and global temperature on this scale. The modern warm period was already scheduled by nature, so the fact that CO2 levels went up during the same general period were an accidental coincidence and not a cause and effect coincidence. Notice the fact that the ups and downs of CO2 do not correspond to the ups and downs of global temperature. Number 8. On the scale of hundreds to thousands of years, CO2 and global temperature show very little correlation. At this time scale, there's even less correlation between temperature and CO2. When there is little to no correlation, there can be no causation. This should be obvious to anyone with a brain. Number 9. On the scale of tens of millions of years, CO2 and global temperature show very little correlation. There are several periods here where CO2 levels went down and temperatures remained high or went up, but even this inverse correlation was not consistent on this timescale, proving that CO2 and temperature had very little to do with each other. Number 10. On the scale of hundreds of millions to billions of years, CO2 and global temperature show very little correlation. Even over the entire life of our planet, CO2 and temperature seem to have close to zero correlation. Notice how CO2 went up and temperatures went down about 800 million years ago. A similar thing happened around the Ordovician-Silurian boundary about 439 million years ago. Notice how CO2 levels went down throughout the Silurian period, while temperatures went back up. During the Carboniferous, CO2 levels went way down, but temperatures stayed high for millions of years, then went down for a significant ice age, and then rebounded long before CO2 levels went back up. Something else was controlling the temperature. At the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary, CO2 levels reached a significant peak. the highest level of the last 350 million years, while temperatures fell for a major cool period that was still far, far warmer than our current Holocene warm interglacial. With CO2 going one way and temperatures going another way, we cannot say that CO2 drives temperature. Only if all graphs on all timescales were like those used by Al Gore could we entertain the idea that CO2 might control temperature. But we'd have to consider the possibility that temperature controls CO2. Correlation does not tell us the direction of causality. This was one of those sneaky tricks used by Al Gore to imply something that was not real. Bonus. Number 11. Water vapor is a far more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. This is because there's so much more water vapor than CO2. The government agencies and other warming alarmists always show only CO2 and other lesser greenhouse gases. They never include water vapor because they want us stuck on CO2 as the bad guy. This is one more of their deceptive tactics. Bonus, number 12. Water has far more powerful cooling effects to regulate Earth's temperature. Evaporative cooling and cloud shading are far more effective controls on global temperature than CO2. As the Earth warms, it causes water to evaporate from the oceans, thus cooling off the oceans and tending to stabilize temperatures. When all that evaporated water vapor reaches higher altitudes, it condenses, forming clouds, which reflect sunlight back into space, thus further cooling the planet's surface. Bonus, number 13. Earth's climate is controlled by a wide variety of factors. Ocean currents, prevailing winds, jet stream, El Niño and La Niña, Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, AMO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation, PDO, Milankovitch cycles, axial tilt of the Earth, precession of the equinoxes, eccentricity of Earth's orbit, possibly the position of the solar system within the disk of the Milky Way galaxy, solar wind. This affects the cosmic ray flux, which affects the rate of cloud formation, Svensmark effect. More solar wind means fewer clouds and a warmer Earth. The correlation between solar wind and global temperature is far higher than between CO2 and temperature. So you see, CO2 is not the 800-pound gorilla the UN and warming alarmists make it out to be.